Dr. Jason Fung is a Toronto physician specializing in the care of patients with kidney diseases. His key responsibility is to oversee the complex management of patients with end-stage kidney disease requiring renal, kidney, dialysis. His credentials do not obviously explain why he should author a book titled The Obesity Code or why he blogs on the intensive dietary management of obesity and type 2 diabetes mellitus. To understand this apparent anomaly, we need first to appreciate who this man is and what makes him so unusual. In treating patients with end-stage kidney disease, Dr. Fung learned two key lessons. First, that type 2 diabetes is the single commonest cause of kidney failure. Second, that renal dialysis, however sophisticated and even life-prolonging, treats only the final symptoms of an underlying disease that has been present for 20, 30, 40 or perhaps even 50 years. Gradually, it dawned on Dr. Fung that he was practicing medicine exactly as he had been taught. By reactively treating the symptoms of complex diseases without first trying to understand or correct their root causes. He realized that to make a difference to his patients, he would have to start by acknowledging a bitter truth. That our venerated profession is no longer interested in addressing the causes of disease. Instead, it wastes much of its time and many of its resources attempting to treat symptoms. He resolved to make a real difference to his patients and his profession by striving to understand the true causes that underlie disease. Before December 2014, I was unaware of Dr. Jason Fung's existence. Then one day I chanced upon his two lectures, The Two Big Lies of Type 2 Diabetes and How to Reverse Type 2 Diabetes Naturally, on YouTube. As someone with a special interest in type 2 diabetes, not least because I have the condition myself, I was naturally intrigued. Who, I thought, is this bright young man? What gives him the certainty that type 2 diabetes can be reversed naturally? And how can he be brave enough to accuse his noble profession of lying? He will need to present a good argument, I thought. It took only a few minutes to realize that Dr. Fung is not only legitimate, but also more than able to look after himself in any medical scrap. The argument he presented was one that had been bouncing around, unresolved, in my own mind for at least 3 years. But I had never been able to see it with the same clarity or to explain it with the same emphatic simplicity as had Dr. Fung. By the end of his 2 lectures, I knew that I had observed a young master at work. Finally, I understood what I had missed. What Dr. Fung achieved in those 2 lectures was to utterly destroy the currently popular model for the medical management of type 2 diabetes, the model mandated by all the different diabetes associations around the world. Worse, he explained why this erroneous model of treatment must inevitably harm the health of all patients unfortunate enough to receive it. According to Dr. Fung, the first big lie in the management of type 2 diabetes is the claim that it is a chronically progressive disease that simply gets worse with time, even in those who comply with the best treatments modern medicine offers. But, Dr. Fung argues, this is simply not true. 50% of the patients on Dr. Fung's Intensive Dietary Management (IDM) program, which combines dietary carbohydrate restriction and fasting, are able to stop using insulin after a few months. So why are we unable to acknowledge the truth? Dr. Fung's answer is simple. We doctors lie to ourselves. If type 2 diabetes is a curable disease, but all our patients are getting worse on the treatments we prescribe, then we must be bad doctors. And since we did not study for so long at such great cost to become bad doctors, this failure cannot be our fault. Instead, we must believe we are doing the best for our patients, who must unfortunately be suffering from a chronically progressive and incurable disease. It is not a deliberate lie, Dr. Fung concludes, but one of cognitive dissonance, the inability to accept a blatant truth because accepting it would be too emotionally devastating. The second lie, according to Dr. Fung, is our belief that type 2 diabetes is a disease of abnormal blood glucose levels, for which the only correct treatment is progressively increasing insulin dosages. He argues, instead, that type 2 diabetes is a disease of insulin resistance with excessive insulin secretion, in contrast to type 1 diabetes, a condition of true insulin lack. To treat both conditions the same way, by injecting insulin, makes no sense. Why treat a condition of insulin excess with yet more insulin, he asks. That is the equivalent of prescribing alcohol for the treatment of alcoholism. Dr. Fung's novel contribution is his insight that treatment in type 2 diabetes focuses on the symptom of the disease, an elevated blood glucose concentration, rather than its root cause, insulin resistance. And the initial treatment for insulin resistance is to limit carbohydrate intake. Understanding this simple biology explains why this disease may be reversible in some cases and, conversely, why the modern treatment of type 2 diabetes, which does not limit carbohydrate intake, worsens the outcome. But how did Dr. Fung arrive at these outrageous conclusions? And how did they lead to his authorship of this book? In addition to his realization, described above, of the long-term nature of disease and the logic of treating a disease's symptoms rather than removing its cause, he also, almost by chance, in the early 2000s, became aware of the growing literature on the benefits of low-carbohydrate diets in those with obesity and other conditions of insulin resistance. Thought to believe that a carbohydrate-restricted, high-fat diet kills, he was shocked to discover the opposite. This dietary choice produces a range of highly beneficial metabolic outcomes, especially in those with the worst insulin resistance. And finally came the cherry on the top: a legion of hidden studies showing that for the reduction of body weight in those with obesity and insulin resistance, this high-fat diet is at least as effective, and usually much more so, than other more conventional diets. Eventually, he could bear it no longer. If everyone knows, but won't admit, that the low-fat calorie-restricted diet is utterly ineffective in controlling body weight or in treating obesity, surely it is time to tell the truth. The best hope for treating and preventing obesity, a disease of insulin resistance and excessive insulin production, must surely be the same low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet used for the management of the ultimate disease of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. And so this book was born. In the Obesity Code, Dr. Fung has produced perhaps the most important popular book yet published on this topic of obesity. Its strengths are that it is based on an irrefutable biology, the evidence for which is carefully presented, and it is written with the ease and confidence of a master communicator in an accessible, well-reasoned sequence, so that its consecutive chapters systematically develop, layer by layer, an evidence-based biological model of obesity that makes complete sense in its logical simplicity. It includes just enough science to convince the skeptical scientist, but not so much that it confuses those without a background in biology. This feat in itself is a stunning achievement that few science writers ever accomplish. By the end of the book, the careful reader will understand exactly the causes of the obesity epidemic, why our attempts to prevent both the obesity and diabetes epidemics were bound to fail, and what, more importantly, are the simple steps that those with a weight problem need to take to reverse their obesity. The solution needed is that which Dr. Fung has now provided. Obesity is a multifactorial disease. What we need is a framework, a structure, a coherent theory to understand how all its factors fit together. Too often, our current model of obesity assumes that there is only one single true cause and that all others are pretenders to the throne. Endless debates ensue. They are all partially correct. In providing one such coherent framework that can account for most of what we currently know about the real causes of obesity, Dr. Fung has provided much, much more. He has provided a blueprint for the reversal of the greatest medical epidemics facing modern society, epidemics that he shows are entirely preventable and potentially reversible, but only if we truly understand their biological causes, not just their symptoms. The truth he expresses will one day be acknowledged as self-evident. The sooner that day dawns, the better for us all. Introduction: the art of medicine is quite peculiar. Once in a while, medical treatments become established that don't really work. Through sheer inertia, these treatments get handed down from one generation of doctors to the next and survive for a surprisingly long time, despite their lack of effectiveness. Consider the medicinal use of leeches, bleeding, or, say, routine tonsillectomy. Unfortunately, the treatment of obesity is also one such example. Obesity is defined in terms of a person's body mass index, calculated as a person's weight in kilograms divided by the square of their height in meters. A body mass index greater than 30 is defined as obese. For more than 30 years, doctors have recommended a low-fat, calorie-reduced diet as the treatment of choice for obesity. Yet the obesity epidemic accelerates. From 1985 to 2011, the prevalence of obesity in Canada tripled, from 6% to 18%. This phenomenon is not unique to North America, but involves most of the nations of the world. Virtually every person who has used caloric reduction for weight loss has failed. And, really, who hasn't tried it? By every objective measure, this treatment is completely and utterly ineffective. Yet it remains the treatment of choice, defended vigorously by nutritional authorities. As a nephrologist, I specialize in kidney disease, the most common cause of which is type 2 diabetes with its associated obesity. I've often watched patients start insulin treatment for their diabetes, knowing that most will gain weight. Patients are rightly concerned. "Doctor," they say, "you've always told me to lose weight. But the insulin you gave me makes me gain so much weight. How is this helpful?" For a long time, I didn't have a good answer for them. That nagging unease grew. Like many doctors, I believed that weight gain was a caloric imbalance, eating too much and moving too little. But if that were so, why did the medication I prescribed, insulin, cause such relentless weight gain? Everybody, health professionals and patients alike, understood that the root cause of type 2 diabetes lay in weight gain. There were rare cases of highly motivated patients who had lost significant amounts of weight. Their type 2 diabetes would also reverse course. Logically, since weight was the underlying problem, it deserved significant attention. Still, it seemed that the health profession was not even the least bit interested in treating it. I was guilty as charged. Despite having worked for more than 20 years in medicine, I found that my own nutritional knowledge was rudimentary, at best. Treatment of this terrible disease obesity was left to large corporations like Weight Watchers, as well as various hucksters and charlatans, mostly interested in peddling the latest weight loss miracle. Doctors were not even remotely interested in nutrition. Instead, the medical profession seemed obsessed with finding and prescribing the next new drug. You have type 2 diabetes? Here, let me give you a pill. You have high blood pressure? Here, let me give you a pill. You have high cholesterol? Here, let me give you a pill. You have kidney disease? Here, let me give you a pill. But all along, we needed to treat obesity. We were trying to treat the problems caused by obesity, rather than obesity itself. In trying to understand the underlying cause of obesity, I eventually established the Intensive Dietary Management Clinic in Toronto, Canada. The conventional view of obesity as a caloric imbalance did not make sense. Caloric reduction had been prescribed for the last 50 years with startling ineffectiveness. Reading books on nutrition was no help. That was mostly a game of he said, she said, with many quoting authoritative doctors. For example, Dr. Dean Ornish says that dietary fat is bad and carbohydrates are good. He is a respected doctor, so we should listen to him. But Dr. Robert Atkins said dietary fat is good and carbohydrates are bad. He was also a respected doctor, so we should listen to him. Who is right? Who is wrong? In the science of nutrition, there is rarely any consensus about anything. Dietary fat is bad. No, dietary fat is good. There are good fats and bad fats. Carbohydrates are bad. No, carbohydrates are good. There are good carbs and bad carbs. You should eat more meals a day. No, you should eat fewer meals a day. Count your calories. No, calories don't count. Milk is good for you. No, milk is bad for you. Meat is good for you. No, meat is bad for you. To discover the answers, we need to turn to evidence-based medicine rather than vague opinion. Literally thousands of books are devoted to dieting and weight loss, usually written by doctors, nutritionists, personal trainers and other health experts. However, with a few exceptions, rarely is more than a cursory thought spared for the actual causes of obesity. What makes us gain weight? Why do we get fat? The major problem is the complete lack of a theoretical framework for understanding obesity. Current theories are ridiculously simplistic, often taking only one factor into account. Excess calories cause obesity. Excess carbohydrates cause obesity. Excess meat consumption causes obesity. Excess dietary fat causes obesity. Too little exercise causes obesity. But all chronic diseases are multifactorial, and these factors are not mutually exclusive. They may all contribute to varying degrees. For example, heart disease has numerous contributing factors: family history, gender, smoking, diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure and a lack of physical activity, to name only a few, and that fact is well accepted. But such is not the case in obesity research. The other major barrier to understanding is the focus on short-term studies. Obesity usually takes decades to fully develop. Yet we often rely on information about it from studies that are only of several weeks' duration. If we study how rust develops, we would need to observe metal over a period of weeks to months, not hours. Obesity, similarly, is a long-term disease. Short-term studies may not be informative. While I understand that the research is not always conclusive, I hope this book, which draws on what I've learned over 20 years of helping patients with type 2 diabetes lose weight permanently to manage their disease, will provide a structure to build upon. Evidence-based medicine does not mean taking every piece of low-quality evidence at face value. I often read statements such as low-fat diets proven to completely reverse heart disease. The reference will be a study of 5 rats. That hardly qualifies as evidence. I will reference only studies done on humans, and mostly only those that have been published in high-quality, peer-reviewed journals. No animal studies will be discussed in this book. The reason for this decision can be illustrated in the parable of the cow. 2 cows were discussing the latest nutritional research, which had been done on lions. One cow says to the other, "Did you hear that we've been wrong these last 200 years? The latest research shows that eating grass is bad for you and eating meat is good." So the 2 cows began eating meat. Shortly afterward, they got sick and they died. 1 year later, 2 lions were discussing the latest nutritional research, which was done on cows. One lion said to the other that the latest research showed that eating meat kills you and eating grass is good. So, the 2 lions started eating grass, and they died. What's the moral of the story? We are not mice. We are not rats. We are not chimpanzees or spider monkeys. We are human beings, and therefore we should consider only human studies. I am interested in obesity in humans, not obesity in mice. As much as possible, I try to focus on causal factors rather than association studies. It is dangerous to assume that because two factors are associated, one is the cause of the other. Witness the hormone replacement therapy disaster in postmenopausal women. Hormone replacement therapy was associated with lower heart disease, but that did not mean that it was the cause of lower heart disease. However, in nutritional research, it is not always possible to avoid association studies, as they are often the best available evidence. Part 1 of this book, The Epidemic, explores the timeline of the obesity epidemic and the contribution of the patient's family history and shows how both shed light on the underlying causes. Part 2, The Calorie Deception, reviews the current caloric theory in depth, including exercise and overfeeding studies. The shortcomings of the current understanding of obesity are highlighted. Part 3, A New Model of Obesity, introduces the hormonal theory of obesity, a robust explanation of obesity as a medical problem. These chapters explain the central role of insulin in regulating body weight and describe the vitally important role of insulin resistance. Part 4, The Social Phenomenon of Obesity, considers how hormonal obesity theory explains some of the associations of obesity. Why is obesity associated with poverty? What can we do about childhood obesity? Part 5, What's Wrong with Our Diet, explores the role of fat, protein and carbohydrates, the three macronutrients, in weight gain. In addition, we examine one of the main culprits in weight gain, fructose, and the effects of artificial sweeteners. Part 6, The Solution provides guidelines for lasting treatment of obesity by addressing the hormonal imbalance of high blood insulin. Dietary guidelines for reducing insulin levels include reducing added sugar and refined grains, keeping protein consumption moderate, and adding healthy fat and fiber. Intermittent fasting is an effective way to treat insulin resistance without incurring the negative effects of calorie reduction diets. Stress management and sleep improvement can reduce cortisol levels and control insulin. The Obesity Code will set forth a framework for understanding the condition of human obesity. While obesity shares many important similarities and differences with type 2 diabetes, this is primarily a book about obesity. The process of challenging current nutritional dogma is, at times, unsettling, but the health consequences are too important to ignore. What actually causes weight gain and what can we do about it? This question is the overall theme of this book. The fresh framework for the understanding and treatment of obesity represents a new hope for a healthier future. How obesity became an epidemic. Here's the question that has always bothered me: why are there doctors who are fat? Accepted as authorities in human physiology, doctors should be true experts on the causes and treatments of obesity. Most doctors are also very hardworking and self-disciplined. Since nobody wants to be fat, doctors in particular should have both the knowledge and the dedication to stay thin and healthy. So why are there fat doctors? The standard prescription for weight loss is eat less, move more. It sounds perfectly reasonable. But why doesn't it work? Perhaps people wanting to lose weight are not following this advice. The mind is willing, but the flesh is weak. Yet consider the self-discipline and dedication needed to complete an undergraduate degree, medical school, internship, residency and fellowship. It is hardly conceivable that overweight doctors simply lack the willpower to follow their own advice. This leaves the possibility that the conventional advice is simply wrong. And if it is, then our entire understanding of obesity is fundamentally flawed. Given the current epidemic of obesity, I suspect that such is the most likely scenario. So we need to start at the very beginning, with a thorough understanding of the disease that is human obesity. We must start with the single most important question regarding obesity or any disease: what causes it? We spend no time considering this crucial question because we think we already know the answer. It seems so obvious. It's a matter of calories in versus calories out. The calorie is a unit of food energy used by the body for various functions such as breathing, building new muscle and bone, pumping blood and other metabolic tasks. Some food energy is stored as fat. Calories in is the food energy that we eat. Calories out is the energy expended for all of these various metabolic functions. When the number of calories we take in exceeds the number of calories we burn, weight gain results, we say. Eating too much and exercising too little causes weight gain, we say. Eating too many calories causes weight gain, we say. These truths seem so self-evident that we do not question whether they are actually true. But are they? Excess calories may certainly be the proximate cause of weight gain, but not its ultimate cause. What's the difference between proximate and ultimate? The proximate cause is immediately responsible, whereas the ultimate cause is what started the chain of events. Consider alcoholism. What causes alcoholism? The proximate cause is drinking too much alcohol, which is undeniably true, but not particularly useful. The question and the cause here are one and the same, since alcoholism means drinking too much alcohol. Treatment advice directed against the proximate cause: stop drinking so much alcohol is not useful. The crucial question, the one that we are really interested in, is what is the ultimate cause of why alcoholism occurs? The ultimate cause includes the addictive nature of alcohol, any family history of alcoholism, excessive stress in the home situation and/or an addictive personality. There we have the real disease, and treatment must be directed against the ultimate rather than the proximate cause. Understanding the ultimate cause leads to effective treatment such as, in this case, rehabilitation and social support networks. Let's take another example. Why does a plane crash? The proximate cause is, there was not enough lift to overcome gravity. Again, absolutely true, but not in any way useful. The ultimate cause might be human error, mechanical fault and/or inclement weather. Understanding the ultimate cause leads to effective solutions, such as better pilot training or tighter maintenance schedules. Advice to generate more lift than gravity, larger wings, more powerful engines, will not reduce plane crashes. This understanding applies to everything. For instance, why is it so hot in this room? Proximate cause. Heat energy coming in is greater than heat energy leaving. Solution: turn on the fans to increase the amount of heat leaving. Ultimate cause: the thermostat is set too high. Solution: turn down the thermostat. Why is the boat sinking? Proximate cause: gravity is stronger than buoyancy. Solution: reduce gravity by lightening the boat. Ultimate cause: the boat has a large hole in the hull. Solution: patch the hole. In each case, the solution to the proximate cause of the problem is neither lasting nor meaningful. By contrast, treatment of the ultimate cause is far more successful. The same applies to obesity. What causes weight gain? Proximate cause: consuming more calories than you expend. If more calories in than out is the proximate cause, the unspoken answer to that last question is that the ultimate cause is personal choice. We choose to eat chips instead of broccoli. We choose to watch TV instead of exercise. Through this reasoning, obesity is transformed from a disease that needs to be investigated and understood into a personal failing, a character defect. Instead of searching for the ultimate cause of obesity, we transform the problem into eating too much, gluttony, and/or exercising too little, sloth. Gluttony and sloth are two of the 7 deadly sins. So we say of the obese that they brought it on themselves. They let themselves go. It gives us the comforting illusion that we understand ultimate cause of the problem. In a 2012 online poll, 61% of US adults believed that personal choices about eating and exercise were responsible for the obesity epidemic. So we discriminate against people who are obese. We both pity and loathe them. However, on simple reflection, this idea simply cannot be true. Prior to puberty, boys and girls average the same body fat percentage. After puberty, women on average carry close to 50% more body fat than men. This change occurs despite the fact that men consume more calories on average than women. But why is this true? What is the ultimate cause? It has nothing to do with personal choices. It is not a character defect. Women are not more gluttonous or lazier than men. The hormonal cocktail that differentiates men and women must make it more likely that women will accumulate excess calories as fat as opposed to burning them off. Pregnancy also induces significant weight gain. What is the ultimate cause? Again, it is obviously the hormonal changes resulting from the pregnancy, not personal choice, that encourages weight gain. Having earned and understanding the proximate and ultimate causes, we believe the solution to obesity is to eat fewer calories. The authorities all agree. The US Department of Agriculture's Dietary Guidelines for Americans, updated in 2010, forcefully proclaims its key recommendation: control total calorie intake to manage body weight. The Centers for Disease Control to exhort patients to balance their calories. The advice from the National Institutes of Health's pamphlet Aim for a Healthy Weight is to cut down on the number of calories they get from food and beverages and increase their physical activity. 3. All this advice forms the famous eat less, move more strategy so beloved by obesity experts. But here's a peculiar thought. If we already understand what causes obesity, how to treat it, and we've spent millions of dollars on education and obesity programs, why are we getting fatter? Anatomy of an epidemic. We weren't always so obsessed with calories. Throughout most of human history, obesity has been rare. Individuals in traditional societies eating traditional diets seldom became obese, even in times of abundant food. As civilizations developed, obesity followed. Speculating on the cause, many identified the refined carbohydrates of sugar and starches. Sometimes considered the father of the low-carbohydrate diet, Jean-Anthony Brillat-Savarin, 1755-1826, wrote the influential textbook The Physiology of Taste in 1825. There he wrote, "The second of the chief causes of obesity is the floury and starchy substances which man makes the prime ingredients of his daily nourishment. As we have said already, all animals that live on farinaceous food grow fat willy-nilly, and man is no exception to the universal law. 4. All foods can be divided into three different macronutrient groups: fat, protein and carbohydrates. The macro and macronutrients refers to the fact that the bulk of the food we eat is made up of these three groups. Micronutrients, which make up a very small proportion of the food, include vitamins and minerals such as vitamins A, B, C, D, E and K, as well as minerals such as iron and calcium. Starchy foods and sugars are all carbohydrates. Several decades later, William Banting (1796–1878), an English undertaker, rediscovered the fattening properties of the refined carbohydrate. In 1863, he published the pamphlet Letter on Corpulence, addressed to the public, which is often considered the world's first diet book. His story is rather unremarkable. He was not an obese child, nor did he have a family history of obesity. In his mid-30s, however, he started to gain weight. Not much, perhaps a pound or two per year. By age 62, he stood 5'5" and weighed 202 pounds, 92 kilograms. Perhaps unremarkable by modern standards, he was considered quite portly at the time. Distressed, he sought advice on weight loss from his physicians. First, he tried to eat less, but that only left him hungry. Worse, he failed to lose weight. Next, he increased his exercise by rowing along the River Thames, near his home in London. While his physical fitness improved, he developed a prodigious appetite, which I was compelled to indulge. 5. Still, he failed to lose weight. Finally, on the advice of his surgeon, Banting tried a new approach. With the idea that sugary and starchy foods were fattening, he strenuously avoided all breads, milk, beer, sweets and potatoes that had previously made up a large portion of his diet. Today we would call this diet low in refined carbohydrates. William Banting not only lost the weight and kept it off, but he also felt so well that he was compelled to write his famous pamphlet. Weight gain, he believed, resulted from eating too many fattening carbohydrates. For most of the next century, diets low in refined carbohydrates were accepted as the standard treatment for obesity. By the 1950s, it was fairly standard advice. If you were to ask your grandparents what caused obesity, they would not talk about calories. Instead, they would tell you to stop eating sugary and starchy foods. Common sense and empirical observation served to confirm the truth. Nutritional experts and government opinion were not needed. Calorie counting had begun in the early 1900s with the book Eat Your Way to Health, written by Dr. Robert Hurrows, as a scientific system of weight control. That book was followed up in 1918 with the bestseller Diet and Health, with Key to the Calories, written by Dr. Lulu Hunt Peters, an American doctor and newspaper columnist. Herbert Hoover, then the head of the U.S. Food Administration, converted to calorie counting. Dr. Peters advised patients to start with a fast, 1 to 2 days abstaining from all foods, and then stick strictly to 1,200 calories per day. While the advice to fast was quickly forgotten, modern calorie counting schedules are not very different. By the 1950s, a perceived great epidemic of heart disease was becoming an increasing public concern. Seemingly healthy Americans were developing heart attacks with growing regularity. In hindsight, it should have been obvious that there was really no such epidemic. The discovery of vaccines and antibiotics, combined with increased public sanitation, had reshaped the medical landscape. Formerly lethal infections, such as pneumonia, tuberculosis and gastrointestinal infections, became curable. Heart disease and cancer now caused a relatively greater percentage of deaths, giving rise to some of the public misperception of an epidemic. See Figure 1.1.6. The increase in life expectancy from 1900 to 1950 reinforced the perception of a coronary disease epidemic. For a white male, the life expectancy in 1900 was 50 years. 7 by 1950, it had reached 66 years, and by 1970, almost 68 years. If people were not dying of tuberculosis, then they would live long enough to develop their heart attack. Currently, the average age at first heart attack is 66 years. 8 The risk of a heart attack in a 50-year-old man is substantially lower than in a 68-year-old man. So the natural consequence of a longer life expectancy is an increased rate of coronary disease. But all great stories need a villain, and dietary fat was cast into that role. Dietary fat was thought to increase the amount of cholesterol, a fatty substance that is thought to contribute to heart disease, in the blood. Soon, physicians began to advocate lower-fat diets. With great enthusiasm and shaky science, the demonization of dietary fat began in earnest. There was a problem, though we didn't see it at the time. The three macronutrients are fat, protein and carbohydrates. Lowering dietary fat meant replacing it with either protein or carbohydrates. Since many high-protein foods like meat and dairy are also high in fat, it is difficult to lower fat in the diet without lowering protein as well. So, if one were to restrict dietary fats, then one must increase dietary carbohydrates, and vice versa. In the developed world, these carbohydrates all tend to be highly refined. Low fat equals high carbohydrate. This dilemma created significant cognitive dissonance. Refined carbohydrates could not simultaneously be both good because they are low in fat and bad because they are fattening. The solution adopted by most nutrition experts was to suggest that carbohydrates were no longer fattening. Instead, calories were fattening. Without evidence or historical precedent, it was arbitrarily decided that excess calories caused weight gain, not specific foods. Fat, as the dietary villain, was now deemed fattening, a previously unknown concept. The calories in, calories out model began to displace the prevailing fattening carbohydrates model. But not everybody bought in. One of the most famous dissidents was the prominent British nutritionist John Yudkin, 1910-1995. Studying diet and heart disease, he found no relationship between dietary fat and heart disease. He believed that the main culprit of both obesity and heart disease was sugar. 9. His 1972 book, Pure, Wide and Deadly: How Sugar is Killing Us, is eerily prescient and should certainly win the award for best book title ever. Scientific debate raged back and forth about whether the culprit was dietary fat or sugar. The dietary giddle. The issue was finally settled in 1977, not by scientific debate and discovery, but by governmental decree. George McGovern, then chairman of the United States Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, convened a tribunal, and after several days of deliberation, it was decided that henceforth, dietary fat was guilty as charged. Not only was dietary fat guilty of causing heart disease, but it also caused obesity, since fat is calorically dense. The resulting declaration became the dietary goals for the United States. An entire nation, and soon the entire world, would now follow nutritional advice from a politician. This was a remarkable break from tradition. For the first time, a government institution intruded into the kitchens of America. Mom used to tell us what we should and should not eat. But from now on, Big Brother would be telling us. And he said, eat less fat and more carbohydrates. Several specific dietary goals were set forth. These included: raise consumption of carbohydrates until they constituted 55% to 60% of calories, and decrease fat consumption from approximately 40% of calories to 30%, of which no more than 1/3 should come from saturated fat. With no scientific evidence, the formerly fattening carbohydrate made a stunning transformation. While the guidelines still recognized the evils of sugar, refined grain was as innocent as a nun in a convent. Its nutritional sins were exonerated, and it was henceforth reborn and baptized as the healthy whole grain. Was there any evidence? It hardly mattered. The goals were now the nutritional orthodoxy. Everything else was heathen. If you didn't toe the line, you were ridiculed. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans, a report released in 1980 for widespread public consumption, followed the recommendations of the McGovern report closely. The nutritional landscape of the world was forever changed. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans, now updated every 5 years, spawned the infamous food pyramid in all its counterfactual glory. The foods that formed the base of the pyramid, the foods we should eat every single day, were breads, pastas and potatoes. These were the precise foods that we had previously avoided to stay thin. For example, the American Heart Association's 1995 pamphlet, The American Heart Association Diet: An Eating Plan for Healthy Americans, declared we should eat 6 or more servings of breads, cereals, pasta and starchy vegetables that are low in fat and cholesterol. To drink, choose fruit punches, carbonated soft drinks. White bread and carbonated soft drinks, the dinner of champions. Thank you, American Heart Association. Entering this brave new world, Americans tried to comply with the nutritional authorities of the day and made a conscious effort to eat less fat, less red meat, fewer eggs and more carbohydrates. When doctors advised people to stop smoking, rates dropped from 33% in 1979 to 25% by 1994. When doctors said to control blood pressure and cholesterol, there was a 40% decline in high blood pressure and a 28% decline in high cholesterol. When the AHA told us to eat more bread and drink more juice, we ate more bread and drank more juice. Inevitably, sugar consumption increased. From 1820 to 1920, new sugar plantations in the Caribbean and American South increased the availability of sugar in the U.S. Sugar intake plateaued from 1920 to 1977. Even though avoid too much sugar was an explicit goal of the 1977 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, consumption increased anyway until the year 2000. With all our attention focused on fat, we took our eyes off the ball. Everything was low fat or low cholesterol, and nobody was paying attention to sugar. Food processors, figuring this out, increased the added sugars in processed food for flavor. Refined grain consumption increased by almost 45%. Since carbohydrates in North America tended to be refined, we ate more and more low-fat bread and pasta, not cauliflower and kale. 11. Success. From 1976 to 1996, the average fat intake decreased from 45% of calories to 35%. Butter consumption decreased 38%. Animal protein decreased 13%. Egg consumption decreased 18%. Grains and sugars increased. Until that point, the widespread adoption of the low-fat diet was completely untested. We had no idea what effect it would have on human health. But we had the fatal conceit that we were somehow smarter than 200,000 years of Mother Nature. So, turning away from the natural fats, we embraced refined low-fat carbohydrates, such as bread and pasta. Ironically, the American Heart Association, even as late as the year 2000, felt that low-carbohydrate diets were dangerous fads, despite the fact that these diets had been in use almost continuously since 1863. What was the result? The incidence of heart disease certainly did not decrease as expected. But there was definitely a consequence to this dietary manipulation, an unintentional one. Rates of obesity, defined as having a body mass index greater than 30, dramatically increased, starting almost exactly in 1977, as illustrated by Figure 1.2.12. The abrupt increase in obesity began exactly with the officially sanctioned move toward a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Was it mere coincidence? Perhaps the fault lay in our genetic makeup instead. Inheriting obesity. It is fairly obvious that obesity runs in families. 1. Obese children often have obese siblings. Obese children become obese adults. 2. Obese adults go on to have obese children. Childhood obesity is associated with a 200% to 400% increased risk of adult obesity. This is an undeniable fact. The controversy revolves around whether this trend is a genetic or an environmental problem, the classic nature versus nurture debate. Families share genetic characteristics that may lead to obesity. However, obesity has become rampant only since the 1970s. Our genes could not have changed within such a short time. Genetics can explain much of the inter-individual risk of obesity, but not why entire populations become obese. Nonetheless, families live in the same environment, eat similar foods at similar times, and have similar attitudes. Families often share cars, live in the same physical space, and will be exposed to the same chemicals that may cause obesity, so-called chemical obesogens. For these reasons, many consider the current environment the major cause of obesity. Conventional calorie-based theories of obesity place the blame squarely on this toxic environment that encourages eating and discourages physical exertion. Dietary and lifestyle habits have changed considerably since the 1970s, including adoption of a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, increased number of eating opportunities per day, more meals eating out, more fast food restaurants, more time spent in cars and vehicles, increased popularity of videos games, increased use of computers, increase in dietary sugar, increased use of high-fructose corn syrup, and increased portion sizes. Any or all of these factors may contribute to the obesogenic environment. Therefore, most modern theories of obesity discount the importance of genetic factors, believing instead that consumption of excess calories leads to obesity. Eating and moving are voluntary behaviors, after all, with little genetic input. So exactly how much of a role does genetics play in human obesity? Nature versus nurture. The classic method for determining the relative impact of genetic versus environmental factors is to study adoptive families, thereby removing genetics from the equation. By comparing adoptees to their biological and adoptive parents, the relative contribution of environmental influences can be isolated. Dr. Albert J. Stunkard performed some of the classic genetic studies of obesity. 3 Data about biological parents is often incomplete, confidential, and not easily accessible by researchers. Fortunately, Denmark has maintained a relatively complete registry of adoptions, with information on both sets of parents. Studying a sample of 540 Danish adult adoptees, Dr. Stunkard compared them to both their adoptive and biological parents. If environmental factors were most important, then adoptees should resemble their adoptive parents. If genetic factors were most important, the adoptees should resemble their biological parents. No relationship whatsoever was discovered between the weight of the adoptive parents and the adoptees. Whether adoptive parents were thin or fat made no difference to the eventual weight of the adopted child. The environment provided by the adoptive parents was largely irrelevant. This finding was a considerable shock. Standard calorie-based theories blame environmental factors and human behaviors for obesity. Environmental cues such as dietary habits, fast food, junk food, candy intake, lack of exercise, number of cars, and lack of playgrounds and organized sports are believed crucial in the development of obesity. But they play virtually no role. In fact, the fattest adoptees had the thinnest adoptive parents. Comparing adoptees to their biological parents yielded a considerably different result. Here there was a strong, consistent correlation between their weights. The biological parents had very little or nothing to do with raising these children or teaching them nutritional values or attitudes toward exercise, yet the tendency toward obesity followed them like ducklings. When you took a child away from obese parents and placed them into a thin household, the child still became obese. What was going on? Studying identical twins raised apart is another classic strategy to distinguish environmental and genetic factors. Identical twins share identical genetic material, and fraternal twins share 25% of their genes. In 1991, Dr. Stunkert examined sets of fraternal and identical twins in both conditions of being reared apart and reared together. 4 comparison of their weights would determine the effect of the different environments. The result sent a shockwave through the obesity research community. Approximately 70% of the variance in obesity is familial. 70%. 70% of your tendency to gain weight is determined by your parentage. Obesity is overwhelmingly inherited. However, it is immediately clear that inheritance cannot be the sole factor leading to the obesity epidemic. The incidence of obesity has been relatively stable through the decades. Most of the obesity epidemic material is within a single generation. Our genes have not changed in that time span. How can we explain this seeming contradiction? The thrifty gene hypothesis. The first attempt to explain the genetic basis of obesity was the thrifty gene hypothesis, which became popular in the 1970s. This hypothesis assumes that all humans are evolutionarily predisposed to gain weight as a survival mechanism. The argument goes something like this: in Paleolithic times, food was scarce and difficult to obtain. Hunger is one of the most powerful and basic of human instincts. The thrifty gene compels us to eat as much as possible, and this genetic predisposition to gain weight had a survival advantage. Increasing the body's food stores, fat, permitted longer survival during times of scarce or no food. Those who tended to burn the calories instead of storing them were selectively wiped out. However, the thrifty gene is ill-adapted to the modern all-you-can-eat world, as it causes weight gain and obesity. But we are simply following our genetic urge to gain fat. Like a decomposing watermelon, this hypothesis seems quite reasonable on the surface. Cut a little deeper, and you find the rotten core. This theory has long ceased to be taken seriously. However, it is still mentioned in the media, and so its flaws bear some examination. The most obvious problem is that survival in the wild depends on not being either underweight or overweight. A fat animal is slower and less agile than its leaner brethren. Predators would preferentially eat the fatter prey over the harder to catch, lean prey. By the same token, fat predators would find it much more difficult to catch lean and swift prey. Body fatness does not always provide a survival advantage, but instead can be a significant disadvantage. How many times have you seen a fat zebra or gazelle on the National Geographic Channel? What about fat lions and tigers? The assumption that humans are genetically predisposed to overeat is incorrect. Just as there are hormonal signals of hunger, there are multiple hormones that tell us when we're full and stop us from overeating. Consider the all-you-can-eat buffet. It is impossible to simply eat and eat without stopping because we get full. Continuing to eat may make us become sick and throw up. There is no genetic predisposition to overeating. There is, instead, powerful built-in protection against it. The thrifty gene hypothesis assumes chronic food shortages prevented obesity. However, many traditional societies had plentiful food year-round. For example, the Tokelau, a remote tribe in the South Pacific, lived on coconut, breadfruit and fish, which were available year-round. Regardless, obesity was unknown among them until the onset of industrialization and the westernization of their traditional diet. Even in modern-day North America, widespread famine has been uncommon since the Great Depression. Yet the growth of obesity has happened only since the 1970s. In wild animals, morbid obesity is rare, even with an abundance of food, except when it is part of the normal life cycle, as with hibernating animals. Abundant food leads to a rise in the numbers of animals, not an enormous increase in their size. Think about rats or cockroaches. When food is scarce, rat populations are low. When food is plentiful, rat populations explode. There are many more normal-sized rats, not the same number of morbidly obese rats. There is no survival advantage to carrying a very high body fat percentage. A male marathon runner may have 5% to 11% body fat. This amount provides enough energy to survive for more than a month without eating. Certain animals fatten regularly. For instance, bears routinely gain weight before hibernation and they do so without illness. Humans, though, do not hibernate. There is an important difference between being fat and being obese. Obesity is the state of being fat to the point of having detrimental health consequences. Bears, along with whales, walruses and other fat animals are fat but not obese since they suffer no health consequences. They are, in fact, genetically programmed to become fat. We aren't. In humans, evolution did not favor obesity, but rather, leanness. The thrifty gene hypothesis doesn't explain obesity, but what does? As we will see in part 3, a new model of obesity. The root cause of obesity is a complex hormonal imbalance with high blood insulin as its central feature. The hormonal profile of a baby is influenced by the environment in the mother's body before birth, setting up a tendency for high insulin levels and associated obesity later in life. The explanation of obesity as a caloric imbalance simply cannot account for this predominantly genetic effect, since eating and exercise are voluntary behaviors. Obesity as a hormonal imbalance more effectively explains this genetic effect. But inherited factors account for only 70% of the tendency to obesity that we observe. The other 30% of factors are under our control, but what should we do to make the most of this? Are diet and exercise the answer? Traditionally, obesity has been seen as a result of how people process calories, that is, that a person's weight could be predicted by a simple equation. Calories in, calories out equals body fat. This key equation perpetrates what I call the calorie deception. It is dangerous precisely because it appears so simple and intuitive. But what you need to understand is that many false assumptions are built in. Assumption 1. Calories in and calories out are independent of each other. This assumption is a crucial mistake. As we'll see later on in this chapter, experiments and experience have proven this assumption false. Caloric intake and expenditure are intimately dependent variables. Decreasing calories in triggers a decrease in calories out. A 30% reduction in caloric intake results in a 30% decrease in caloric expenditure. The end result is minimal weight loss. Assumption 2. Basal metabolic rate is stable. We obsess about caloric intake with barely a thought for caloric expenditure, except for exercise. Measuring caloric intake is simple, but measuring the body's total energy expenditure is complicated. Therefore, the simple but completely erroneous assumption is made that energy expenditure remains constant except for exercise. Total energy expenditure is the sum of basal metabolic rate, thermogenic effect of food, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption and exercise. The total energy expenditure can go up or down by as much as 50%, depending upon the caloric intake as well as other factors. Assumption 3. We exert conscious control over calories in. Eating is a deliberate act, so we assume that eating is a conscious decision and that hunger plays only a minor role in it. But numerous overlapping hormonal systems influence the decision of when to eat and when to stop. We consciously decide to eat in response to hunger signals that are largely hormonally mediated. We consciously stop eating when the body sends signals of satiety, fullness, that are largely hormonally mediated. For example, the smell of frying food makes you hungry at lunchtime. However, if you have just finished a large buffet, those same smells may make you slightly queasy. The smells are the same. The decision to eat or not is principally hormonal. Our bodies possess an intricate system guiding us to eat or not. Body fat regulation is under automatic control, like breathing. We do not consciously remind ourselves to breathe, nor do we remind our hearts to beat. The only way to achieve such control is to have homeostatic mechanisms. Since hormones control both calories in and calories out, obesity is a hormonal, not a caloric, disorder. Assumption 4. Fat stores are essentially unregulated. Every single system in the body is regulated. Growth and height is regulated by growth hormone. Blood sugars are regulated by the hormones insulin and glucagon, among others. Sexual maturation is regulated by testosterone and estrogen. Body temperature is regulated by a thyroid-stimulating hormone and free thyroxine. The list is endless. We are asked to believe, however, that growth of fat cells is essentially unregulated. The simple act of eating, without any interference from any hormones, will result in fat growth. Extra calories are dumped into fat cells like doorknobs into a sack. This assumption has already been proven false. New hormonal pathways in the regulation of fat growth are being discovered all the time. Leptin is the best-known hormone regulating fat growth, but adiponectin, hormone-sensitive lipase, lipoprotein lipase and adipose triglyceride lipase may all play important roles. If hormones regulate fat growth, then obesity is a hormonal, not a caloric disorder. Assumption 5. A calorie is a calorie. This assumption is the most dangerous of all. It's obviously true. Just like a dog is a dog or a desk is a desk. There are many different kinds of dogs and desks, but the simple statement that a dog is true. However, the real issue is this. Are all calories equally likely to cause fat gain? The calorie is a calorie implies that the only important variable in weight gain is the total caloric intake, and thus, all foods can be reduced to their caloric energy. But does a calorie of olive oil cause the same metabolic response as a calorie of sugar? The answer is, obviously, no. These two foods have many easily measurable differences. Sugar will increase the blood glucose level and provoke an insulin response from the pancreas. Olive oil will not. When olive oil is absorbed by the small intestine and transported to the liver, there is no significant increase in blood glucose or insulin. The two different foods evoke vastly different metabolic and hormonal responses. These 5 assumptions, the key assumptions in the caloric reduction theory of weight loss, have all been proved false. All calories are not equally likely to cause weight gain. The entire caloric obsession was a 50-year dead end. So we must begin again. What causes weight gain? Experimentally, it's easy to study caloric reduction. We take some people, give them less to eat, watch them lose weight and live happily ever after. Bam. Case closed. Call the Nobel Committee. Eat less, move more is the cure for obesity, and caloric reduction truly is the best way to lose weight. Luckily for us, such studies have already been done. A detailed study of total energy expenditure under conditions of reduced caloric intake was done in 1919 at the Carnegie Institute of Washington. 5 volunteers consumed semi-starvation diets of 1,400 to 2,100 calories per day, an amount calculated to be approximately 30% lower than their usual intake. Many current weight loss diets target very similar levels of caloric intake. The question was whether total energy expenditure, calories out, decreases in response to caloric reduction, calories in. What happened? The participants experienced a whopping 30% decrease in total energy expenditure, from an initial caloric expenditure of roughly 3,000 calories to approximately 1,950 calories. Even nearly 100 years ago, it was clear that calories out is highly dependent on calories in. The 30% reduction in caloric intake resulted in a nearly identical 30% reduction in caloric expenditure. The energy budget is balanced. The first law of thermodynamics is not broken. Several decades later, in 1944 and 1945, Dr. Ancel Keys performed the most complete experiment of starvation ever done, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, the details of which were published in 1950 in a 2-volume publication entitled The Biology of Human Starvation. 6. In the aftermath of World War II, millions of people were on the verge of starvation. Yet the physiologic effects of starvation were virtually unknown, having never been scientifically studied. The Minnesota study was an attempt to understand both the caloric reduction and recovery phases of starvation. Improved knowledge would help guide Europe's recovery from the brink. Indeed, as a result of this study, a relief workers' field manual was written detailing psychological aspects of starvation. 7. 36 young, healthy, normal men were selected with an average height of 5 foot 10 inches, 1.78 meters, and an average weight of 153 pounds, 69.3 kilograms. For the first 3 months, subjects received a standard diet of 3,200 calories per day. Over the next 6 months of semi-starvation, only 1,570 calories were given to them. However, caloric intake was continually adjusted to reach a target total weight loss of 24% compared to baseline, averaging 2.5 pounds, 1.1 kilograms per week. Some men eventually received less than 1,000 calories per day. The foods given were high in carbohydrates, similar to those available in war-torn Europe at the time: potatoes, turnips, bread and macaroni. Meat and dairy products were rarely given. In addition, they walked 22 miles per week as exercise. Following this caloric reduction phase, their calories were gradually increased over 3 months of rehabilitation. Expected caloric expenditure was 3,009 calories per day. 8. Even Dr. Keys himself was shocked by the difficulty of the experiment. The men experienced profound physical and psychological changes. Among the most consistent findings was the constant feeling of cold experienced by the participants. As one explained, "I'm cold. In July I walk downtown on a sunny day with a shirt and sweater to keep me warm. At night my well-fed roommate, who isn't in the experiment, sleeps on top of his sheets, but I crawl under 2 blankets." 9. Resting metabolic rate dropped by 40%. Interestingly, this phenomenon is very similar to that of the previous study, which showed a drop of 30%. Measurement of the subject's strength showed a 21% decrease. Heart rate slowed considerably, from an average of 55 beats per minute to only 35. Heart stroke volume decreased by 20%. Body temperature dropped to an average of 95.8 degrees F10. Physical endurance dropped by half. Blood pressure dropped. Men became extremely tired and dizzy. They lost hair and their nails grew brittle. Psychologically, there were equally devastating effects. The men experienced a complete lack of interest in everything except for food, which became an object of intense fascination to them. Some hoarded cookbooks and utensils. They were plagued with constant, unyielding hunger. Some were unable to concentrate, and several withdrew from their university studies. There were several cases of frankly neurotic behavior. Let's reflect on what was happening here. Prior to the study, the subjects ate and also burned approximately 3,000 calories per day. Then, suddenly, their caloric intake was reduced to approximately 1,500 per day. All body functions that require energy experienced an immediate, across the board, 30% to 40% reduction, which wrought complete havoc. Consider the following. Calories are needed to heat the body. Fewer calories were available, so body heat was reduced. Result: constant feeling of cold. Calories are needed for the heart to pump blood. Fewer calories were available, so the pump slowed down. Result: heart rate and stroke volume decreases. Calories are needed to maintain blood pressure. Fewer calories were available, so the body turned the pressure down. Result: blood pressure decreased. Calories are needed for brain function, as the brain is very metabolically active. Fewer calories were available, so cognition was reduced. Result: lethargy and inability to concentrate. Calories are needed to move the body. Fewer calories were available, so movement was reduced. Result: weakness during physical activity. Calories are needed to replace hair and nails. Fewer calories were available, so hair and nails were not replaced. Result: brittle nails and hair loss. The body reacts in this way by reducing energy expenditure because the body is smart and doesn't want to die. What would happen if the body continued to expend 3,000 calories daily while taking in only 1,500? Soon fat stores would be burned, then protein stores would be burned, and then you would die. Nice. The smart course of action for the body is to immediately reduce caloric expenditure to 1,500 calories per day to restore balance. Caloric expenditure may even be adjusted a little lower, say, to 1,400 calories per day, to create a margin of safety. This is exactly what the body does. In other words, the body shuts down. In order to preserve itself, it implements across-the-board reductions in energy output. The crucial point to remember is that doing so ensures survival of the individual in a time of extreme stress. Yeah, you might feel lousy, but you'll live to tell the tale. Reducing output is the smart thing for the body to do. Burning energy it does not have would quickly lead to death. The energy budget must be balanced. Calories in and calories out are highly dependent variables. With reflection, it should immediately be obvious that caloric expenditure must decrease. If we reduce daily calorie intake by 500 calories, we assume that 1 pound, 0.45 kilograms of fat per week is lost. Does that mean that in 200 weeks, we would lose 200 pounds, 91 kilograms, and weigh 0 pounds? Of course not. The body must, at some point, reduce its caloric expenditure to meet the lower caloric intake. It just so happens that this adaptation occurs almost immediately and persists long-term. A man in the Minnesota starvation experiment should have lost 78 pounds, 35.3 kilograms, but the actual weight lost was only 37 pounds, 16.8 kilograms less than half of what was expected. More and more severe caloric restriction was required to continue losing weight. Sound familiar? What happened to their weight after the semi-starvation period? During the semi-starvation phase, body fat dropped much quicker than overall body weight, as fat stores are preferentially used to power the body. Once the participants started the recovery period, they regained the weight rather quickly, in about 12 weeks. But it didn't stop there. Body weight continued to increase until it was actually higher than it was prior to the experiment. The body quickly responds to caloric reduction by reducing metabolism, total energy expenditure, but how long does this adaptation persist? Given enough time, does the body increase its energy expenditure back to its previous higher level if caloric reduction is maintained? The short answer is no. 11 In a 2008 study, participants initially lost 10% of body weight and their total energy expenditure decreased as expected. But how long did this situation last? It remained reduced over the course of the entire study, a full year. Even after 1 year at the new, lower body weight, their total energy expenditure was still reduced by an average of almost 500 calories per day. In response to caloric reduction, metabolism decreases almost immediately, and that decrease persists more or less indefinitely. The applicability of these findings to caloric reduction diets is obvious. Assume that prior to dieting, a woman eats and burns 2,000 calories per day. Following doctor's orders, she adopts a calorie-restricted portion-controlled, low-fat diet, reducing her intake by 500 calories per day. Quickly, her total energy expenditure also drops by 500 calories per day, if not a little more. She feels lousy, tired, cold, hungry, irritable and depressed, but sticks with it, thinking that things must eventually improve. Initially, she loses weight, but as her body's caloric expenditure decreases to match her lowered intake, her weight plateaus. Her dietary compliance is good, but 1 year later, things have not improved. Her weight slowly creeps back up, even though she eats the same number of calories. Tired of feeling so lousy, she abandons the failed diet and resumes eating 2,000 calories per day. Since her metabolism has slowed to an output of only 1,500 calories per day, all her weight comes rushing back as fat. Those around her silently accuse her of lacking willpower. Sound familiar? But her weight regain is not her failure. Instead, it's to be expected. Everything described here has been well documented over the last 100 years. An erroneous assumption. Let's consider a last analogy here. Suppose we manage a coal-fired power plant. Every day to generate energy, we receive and burn 2,000 tons of coal. We also keep some coal stored in a shed, just in case we run low. Now, all of a sudden, we receive only 1,500 tons of coal a day. Should we continue to burn 2,000 tons of coal daily? We would quickly burn through our stores of coal, and then our power plant would be shut down. Massive blackouts develop over the entire city. Anarchy and looting commence. Our boss tells us how utterly stupid we are and yells, "Your ass is fired." Unfortunately for us, he's entirely right. In reality, we'd handle this situation another way. As soon as we realize that we've received only 1,500 tons of coal, we'd immediately reduce our power generation to burn only 1,500 tons. In fact, we might burn only 1,400 tons, just in case there were further reductions in shipments. In the city, a few lights go dim, but there are no widespread blackouts. Anarchy and looting are avoided. Boss says, "Great job. You're not as stupid as you look." Raises all around. We maintain the lower output of 1,500 tons as long as necessary. The key assumption of the theory that reducing caloric intake leads to weight loss is false, since decreased caloric intake inevitably leads to decreased caloric expenditure. This sequence has been proven time and again. We just keep hoping that this strategy will somehow, this time, work. It won't. Face it. In our heart of hearts, we already know it to be true. Caloric reduction and portion control strategies only make you tired and hungry. Worst of all, you regain all the weight you have lost. I know it. You know it. We forget this inconvenient fact because our doctors, our dietitians, our government, our scientists, our politicians and our media have all been screaming at us for decades that weight loss is all about calories in versus calories out. Caloric reduction is primary. Eat less, move more. We have heard it so often that we do not question whether it's the truth. Instead, we believe that the fault lies in ourselves. We feel we have failed. Some silently criticize us for not adhering to the diet. Others silently think we have no willpower and offer us meaningless platitudes. Sound familiar? The failing isn't ours. The portion control caloric reduction diet is virtually guaranteed to fail. Eating less does not result in lasting weight loss. Eating is not under conscious control. By the early 1990s, the battle of the bulge was not going well. The obesity epidemic was gathering momentum, with type 2 diabetes following closely behind. The low-fat campaign was starting to fizzle as the promised benefits had failed to materialize. Even as we were choking down our dry skinless chicken breast and rice cakes, we were getting fatter and sicker. Looking for answers, the National Institutes of Health recruited almost 50,000 postmenopausal women for the most massive, expensive, ambitious and awesome dietary study ever done. Published in 2006, this randomized controlled trial was called the Women's Health Initiative Dietary Modification Trial. 12. This trial is arguably the most important dietary study ever done. Approximately 1/3 of these women received a series of 18 education sessions, group activities, targeted message campaigns and personalized feedback over 1 year. Their dietary intervention was to reduce dietary fat, which was cut down to 20% of daily calories. They also increased their vegetable and fruit intake to 5 servings per day and grains to 6 servings. They were encouraged to increase exercise. The control group was instructed to eat as they normally did. Those in this group were provided with a copy of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, but otherwise received little help. The trial aimed to confirm the cardiovascular health and weight reduction benefits of the low-fat diet. The average weight of participants at the beginning of the study was 169 pounds, 76.8 kilograms. The starting average body mass index was 29.1, putting participants in the overweight category, body mass index of 25 to 29.9, but bordering on obese, body mass index greater than 30. They were followed for 7.5 years to see if the doctor-recommended diet reduced obesity, heart disease and cancer, as much as expected. The group that received dietary counseling succeeded. Daily calories dropped from 1788 to 1446, a day, a reduction of 342 calories per day for over 7 years. Fat as a percentage of calories decreased from 38.8% to 29.8%, and carbohydrates increased from 44.5% to 52.7%. The women increased their daily physical activity by 14%. The control group continued to eat the same higher calorie and higher fat diet to which they were accustomed. The results were telling. The eat less, move more group started out terrifically, averaging more than 4 pounds, 1.8 kilograms, of weight loss over the first year. By the second year, the weight started to be regained, and by the end of the study, there was no significant difference between the two groups. Did these women perhaps replace some of their fat with muscle? Unfortunately, the average waist circumference increased approximately 0.39 inches, 0.6 centimeters, and the average waist to hip ratio increased from 0.82 to 0.83 inches, 2.1 centimeters, which indicates these women were actually fatter than before. Weight loss over 7.5 years of the eat less, move more strategy was not even 1 single kilogram, 2.2 pounds. This study was only the latest in an unbroken string of failed experiments. Caloric reduction as the primary means of weight loss has disappointed repeatedly. Reviews of the literature by the U.S. Department of Agriculture 13 highlight this failure. All these studies, of course, serve only to confirm what we already knew. Caloric reduction doesn't cause lasting weight loss. Anybody who has ever tried it can tell you. Many people tell me, I don't understand. I eat less. I exercise more. But I can't seem to lose any weight. I understand perfectly because this advice has been proven to fail. Do caloric reduction diets work? No. The Women's Health Initiative Dietary Modification Trial was the biggest, baddest, most kick-ass study of the eat less, move more strategy that has even been or ever will be done, and it was a resounding repudiation of that strategy. What is happening when we try to reduce calories and fail to lose weight? Part of the problem is the reduced metabolism that accompanies weight loss. But that's only the beginning. Hunger Games. The calories in, calories out plan for weight loss assumes that we have conscious control over what we eat. But this belief ignores the extremely powerful effect of the body's hormonal state. The defining characteristic of the human body is homeostasis, or adaptation to change. Our body deals with an ever-changing environment. In response, the body makes adjustments to minimize the effects of such changes and return to its original condition. And so it is when the body starts to lose weight. There are two major adaptations to caloric reduction. The first change, as we have seen, is a dramatic reduction in total energy expenditure. The second key change is that the hormonal signals that stimulate hunger increase. The body is pleading with us to eat in order for it to regain the lost weight. This effect was demonstrated in 2011 in an elegant study of hormonal adaptation to weight loss. 14 subjects were given a diet of 500 calories per day, which produced an average weight loss of 29.7 pounds, 13.5 kilograms. Next, they were prescribed a low glycemic index, low-fat diet for weight maintenance and were encouraged to exercise 30 minutes per day. Despite their best intentions, almost half of the weight was regained. Various hormonal levels, including ghrelin, a hormone that, essentially, makes us hungry, were analyzed. Weight loss significantly increased ghrelin levels in the study subjects, even after more than 1 year, compared to the subject's usual baseline. What does that mean? It means that the subjects felt hungrier and continued to feel so, right up to end of the study. The study also measured several satiety hormones, including peptide YY, amylin and cholecystokinin, all of which are released in response to proteins and fats in our diet and serve to make us feel full. This response, in turn, produces the desired effect of keeping us from overeating. More than a year after initial weight loss, the levels of all three satiety hormones were significantly lower than before. What does that mean? It means that the subjects felt less full. With increased hunger and decreased satiety, the desire to eat rises. Moreover, these hormonal changes occur almost immediately and persist almost indefinitely. People on a diet tend to feel hungrier, and that effect isn't some kind of psychological voodoo, nor is it a loss of willpower. Increased hunger is a normal and expected hormonal response to weight loss. Dr. Key's Minnesota starvation experiment first documented the effect of semi-starvation neurosis. People who lose weight dream about food. They obsess about food. All they can think about is food. Interest in all else diminishes. This behavior is not some strange affliction of the obese. In fact, it's entirely hormonally driven and normal. The body, through hunger and satiety signaling, is compelling us to get more food. Losing weight triggers two important responses. First, total energy expenditure is immediately and indefinitely reduced in order to conserve the available energy. Second, hormonal hunger signaling is immediately and indefinitely amplified in an effort to acquire more food. Weight loss results in increased hunger and decreased metabolism. This evolutionary survival strategy has a single purpose: to make us regain the lost weight. Functional magnetic resonance imaging studies show that areas of the brain controlling emotion and cognition light up in response to food stimuli. Areas of the prefrontal cortex involved with restraint show decreased activity. In other words, it is harder for people who have lost weight to resist food. 15. This has nothing whatsoever to do with a lack of willpower or any kind of moral failure. It's a normal hormonal fact of life. We feel hungry, cold, tired and depressed. These are all real, measurable physical effects of calorie restriction. Reduced metabolism and the increased hunger are not the cause of obesity, they are the result. Losing weight causes the reduced metabolism and increased hunger, not the other way around. We do not simply make a personal choice to eat more. One of the great pillars of the caloric reduction theory of obesity that we eat too much because we choose to is simply not true. We do not eat too much because we choose to, or because food is too delicious, or because of salt, sugar and fat. We eat too much because our own brain compels us to.